All right. So thank you all for coming. So as part of the publication class and generously supported by the MFA program, I'd like to welcome Lindsay Buchman, who is our tonight's speaker. And Lindsay is an I can never say that word, interdisciplinary artist and a writer and a publisher based in Brooklyn, New York. And her work explores image making, writing through print and lens-based media, artist books, and installation. Buchman holds an MFA from University of Pennsylvania and a BFA from California State University, Long Beach. Exhibitions of her work has been shown at the Penumbra Foundation, the San Francisco Center for the Book, at the Geffen Contemporary, at the MoCA, in MoMA PS1, at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo. Lindsay has had numerous fellowships, and also she has been artist in residence at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, the Lower East Side Printshop, and the Institute for Electronic Arts at Alfred University. And she's the 2025 Lightwork Artist in Residence in Syracuse. And as an extension of her practice and why she's here, she runs an independent artist books and publication project, Seaton Street Press, to collaborate with artists through publishing and distribution. So let's welcome Lindsay. You should be able to share your screen. If you can't, we can figure it out. I can make you host if necessary.
No, I just muted myself and then went away. Um, I should be good. I'm gonna put this in preview mode and I think that it's going to, can
Yes,
you still see it?
perfect.
Okay, wonderful. If at any point you cannot, let me know. Sometimes it's a little finicky with the preview, and I'm gonna minimize us just sort of at the top. Um, I think that if people have questions along the way, feel free to ask. There's a Q&A at the end, but if there's something you want to flag me from, I'm happy to talk about it. But I wanted to sort of ground us in thinking about publishing as a project, as a longer term vision of a project. So thinking through like what is the practice of publishing and what is its relationship to archives, which is a huge part of what I do as a publisher. So I structured the images chronologically around everything that I've published since, generally everything I've published since 2018, 2019. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and how the press kind of became what it is. So this is just an exhibition that took place in 2022 that I'll kind of come back to from the press. And then related to my bio, just thinking through like my practice is pretty interdisciplinary. I work lens based and I have a background in traditional printmaking, which is formative to my relationship to publishing. It's something that I really work from, like that tradition of printing and editioning and understanding materiality. And so something like this image, which is a archival digital inkjet print on Habitoy, which is like silk, thinking through like how can you change something through materials. So in publishing, that's a pretty natural relationship for me. And the press started in 2018. It began in Philadelphia, where it was based for a long time. Then it was in Hudson briefly. It is in homage to my studio in Los Angeles, where I had a career for about a decade prior to being on the East Coast. And now it is based in Brooklyn. So itinerancy and moving around and being transient is a huge part of the press in terms of how it works, its relationship to site, language, memory, with an emphasis on archival histories, counter narratives, social identities, and geographies is really at the crux of what I do as a publisher. So I wanted to kind of locate the press's history within that. Some specific elements of what the press has focused on for its existence has been committed to marginalized identities and Latine narratives specifically, which you'll see as I kind of talk about projects. I'm interested in focusing on storytelling and thinking through how can stories help us understand issues like migration, gentrification, familial archives. So a lot of the work that I'm publishing, there's a distinct text image relationship. There's an emphasis on the artist's book as the form, and there are differentiations between like what would be understood as a photo book or an artist's book, or let's say a zine, all of which exist within independent publishing. But the emphasis for me is really on this artist book concept. And so through that form, I'm looking to activate language. How do things like autoethnographies, transcribed oral histories, creative nonfiction, hybridized forms of text exists within photographic language in a book form. So where that began was really when I was in graduate school from 2015 to 2017 when I started making artist books. So this image on the left is a photograph of me photographing a book and someone at that time, like a friend, helping me photograph. And really just thinking about how when you're first starting a project, it is conceived of usually bare bones materials and kind of having to like work through what is the thing you're even doing. I have found that a lot of the times I don't know when I'm working. I might just be working intuitively. But because I've been publishing now for a while and I've been making artist books for a decade, it's a little bit easier to understand what it is that I've been doing this whole time. Like looking back gives me a context for that that I did not previously have. So the image on the left is 2016, the image on the right is 2023. And the image on the right is the collation of a book that I'll talk about a little bit later. And so the first artist book I made was this book, LA, a document that was, you can see like my files were really not doing great. Like I put an emphasis on this for a talk I gave recently at Center for Book Arts in New York of just thinking through things you learn along the process, like file organization, like maybe creating a system that makes sense, not just like variation, lightest, darkest, like first image is so irregular at that stage versus kind of coming more full circle, images and exhibitions where the kind of professionalization of the press has changed, it's grown, it's become a little bit sleeker in terms of what it does. So these are from 2022. I had a solo exhibition at what was then Sold Mednick Project Space at University of the Arts, which has sadly since closed. So this was from a couple years back. And then recently, this exhibition, press print, risograph photo books was published or was presented by Camilo Otero and Leandro Villaro at Penumbra Foundation. And so this was a huge exhibition featuring hundreds of Riso, I think over 150 titles of risograph books and several publishers from all throughout the world, and really like a strong emphasis on community. And so I included these to kind of give you a sense of like, what do the books do beyond just the scope of publishing? So really thinking through like, if you're developing something as a vision, whether it be editorial design or otherwise, publication design takes you to different places based on what it is that you're producing. And so I'm always happy to see when the books are included in curatorial endeavors. So it's kind of going back to the beginning. So the first project that I published that was not a book of my own was De Aquí para Allá by Stephanie Garcia, which is a project that was focused on her family's history. And so at the time that I was publishing this project, I don't think I knew how much the project itself would grow. There were certain choices that I made at that time photographically in terms of risograph production. So thinking about something like the cover image, which is a white ink on black paper. It's in halftone. It gives you that kind of like subtle gray. It's like a blue gray or blue white. And the use of something like metallic ink for the typography. And so at that time, I was using things that were accessible to me, skills that I had from printmaking, using the risograph as the printer to tell the story of Stuff's family, who was undocumented the majority of her life. And so the story is told from the perspective of her interviewing her parents. And they talk, it's like two different interviews. So you're kind of like hearing them talking to one another. And there's really an emphasis on social inequality and kind of stereotypes and projections, specifically anti-Mexican sentiments that have happened within a US context. And this was produced shortly after the first presidency of Donald Trump. So I think there's like some overlap actually with the present that is that's like resurfacing in this moment. But the narrative that takes place between the artist and her mother is one in which it's bilingual and it's going back and forth between a kind of understanding of what it meant for her, for Steph, the artist, to grow up with this experience and the kind of moments in which like she's writing about her mom like buying her books until she could know it. Her mom bought her books until she could no longer read them. So it was like she's buying her books even as she can no longer read them, but so Steph can continue to kind of grow and learn English. And so this like really beautiful and tender moments that come up in the text and the image relationship, as well as familial archives. And from Steph's book, so this was like my first introduction to thinking about a split language book and trying to figure out, like, from design, having English and Black, having Spanish and blue, and splitting the pages. So it's like every time you're mirroring something, there's multiple interviews that take place between the artist and her family. There's also an interview with me and the artist because I had edited an interview for something else around that time. So, based on that experience, we decided to turn it into a project and then kind of thought through, well, how could we kind of speak to the work that she had been making, like exhibition design? So, having something like the fold out ephemera that can go with the book, but also is related to the exhibition that her work had been shown in. So, that was the first comprehensive project that I had worked on. And at the same time, I was still making artist books. Like, I've been making artist books for a long time. And I was at that point kind of getting to a place of thinking more about digital offset, more kind of, I would say, like higher end printing quality, but still sort of building on this language component. So I had made this project the same year as hers, that was an essay that came out of the book. So something that was not bound, and thinking through, like, how can we have something loose leaf that can get lost? And the essay was all about disorientation, the physiological nature of disorientation, and the disconnect between looking to a horizon as a form of stability, but it being an illusion, because it is a way in which you can trick your, when you have the vestibular disturbance, which is an inner ear confusion, the body and the mind don't understand where they are in space. It's a physiological experience. And when one looks to the horizon, it often can help with something like motion sickness, but it is not a stable ground. And so this essay kind of writes about this like meandering experience of physiological natures, and then creates this visualization of the shifting ground with this overlaid gray that moves all throughout the book. So the design, like, I think a lot of what I've been doing this whole time is trying to figure out how can you design for experiences that are embodiments for the concepts within a publication. I would say that's an undercurrent to pretty much everything that I've worked on since the beginning. But I think because I've been doing it a while, I sometimes forget how much that guides the projects. But if I look at these earlier works, I can kind of see it. And, if anything, like, I'll talk about it a little later, I think I've moved away from that approach, but earlier on, it was a huge part of what I was working on. And then in 2021, I co-published this project with Mimi and Weaver's Ultra, which is a project space in West Philadelphia run by the artist Charles Hall. Hall is also a friend and peer, and I should mention I predominantly work with people in my community. So a lot of the artists in the early years were artists from Philly because I was based there for so long. So Charles and I worked on this project in 2021, and it was the inaugural volume for his newspaper. He runs a project space that's in West Philly that is for artists, all kinds of art makers, to have exhibitions and to have events. He does a lot of also like local activism and kind of programming in the neighborhood. And he wanted to release the inaugural volume as something that was in dedication to his grandparents. And so his grandparents had run this on the corner right here, this laundromat. At one time, it was a laundromat. And they had been real community, like volunteers, community oriented. And he wanted the first edition to kind of speak to that. So the first issue that we put out was meant to be something that people in the neighborhood could pick up, could come by and get. There was exhibitions happening, which is a part of what he does in the space now. It is no longer a functioning laundromat, but it comes from that history. And he's still really connected to the neighbors and the people in his neighborhood. So it became something that we could do that was almost ephemeral and also collaboratively made. It was designed by Shaquille Greeley. And so there's something that happens like in the language of design where there's a shift from the way that I typically design because we were working with an outside designer, but there's still a connection to materiality, like the use of newspaper being something that's ephemeral, something that's really fleeting. Newspaper ages, it yellows. And so that kind of like lack of preciousness with subjects that were so precious, and thinking through like how important his family is to him. So we released this originally 2021. We just did a re-release in 2024. And these are his grandparents in the last slide. And so the dedication is to them. And then the neighborhood is also in a part of Philly that is undergoing gentrification. So part of the purpose of making a project like this is one to kind of memorialize and historicize in a way the neighborhood as it is, but also to kind of speak to people who are still living in the neighborhood as it's changing, right? So gentrification is something that comes up in a lot of the books, but it definitely is present in this publication. And then around that time, the original release of Ultra in 2021, I was also working on this project with Heather M. O'Brien called like The Delayed Rays of the Star. That is a true photo book. I would say it's of all the books that I've worked on, it is probably categorically truly a photography book. Different, still an artist book, but different than some of the ways artist books function. So a little bit more conventional. We worked with a designer, George Hanna, who is still based in Lebanon. And the artist, Heather M. O'Brien, at that time was based in Beirut as well. She used to teach at AUB, the American University of Beirut. And she was there for a long time and was really struggling through this relationship of ethics and the camera. This question of like, as a Westerner moving to the Middle East, like, what is one's responsibility for photographing a place and kind of combating the sort of US centric misinformation or like propaganda about a place. And so she really struggles with that ethical question and chooses to then make a book that is primarily from her domestic space. So, shot from her home, all of these images kind of within the courtyard, looking out on the balcony, looking out from on top of the building, and really this like soft language of light and time of day and ethereal quality that her work is often kind of known for. But I think in this particular project, it took on different questions of like the role of the photographer when turning inward. There are multiple essays in this book. So something like this one on the top left, The Empires of the Gaze, thinking about the role of the gaze in photography, and it helps kind of frame the way that her work functions. And then there's a lot of emphasis on the Ottoman architecture that is referenced in the project description. So it was something that we thought a lot about. It's like, what happens in terms of emphasis, like in the design, these moments that pause between these maybe more language-based components, just having something filmically build. So it does feel a lot like a film essay, even though it is in the form of a book. And then also sort of around that time, the second release, this technically released the first edition in 2021. I think I published a lot of books that year. It was sort of like when the press was growing, and at that particular time, I think that's when I started publishing like 4 books per year. And so Hyperopia, the first edition, was also published at that time. This project is a risograph book. It's multicolor, so it's 4-color, so often 3-color separations. And it's at a time in the press where like I was getting more into and learning more about multicolor printing to create the effect of something that would be photographic, but produced with a risograph rather than digitally printed. And so there's this kind of lineage that happens around this time that just starts to build out. It ends up becoming the focus of what I do as a printer and as a publisher. This was printed by the artist, Matt Neff, who is a longtime collaborator of the press, who knows how to print in the same style. So we often collaboratively would print on projects. And this project was really about the history of images, kind of thinking about images as standing in for forgotten histories. There's a lot of layering and repositioning. It's essentially an archive of his work across many years where images are like Photoshop and overlaid and then printed in this kind of like full bleed structure. And they have this quality to them that also really relates to light, which I think is sort of like from where I started and where I ended up continues to be something that I am building on. Like there's a language of light throughout each person's project. It maybe becomes most emphasized in more recent publications that I've been working on. It's predominantly, this particular book is like all full bleeds. There's very little context for understanding the work. There's a Michel Rolfe Trio quote at the end of the book that talks a bit about historical actors and the kind of role of things that are left behind or forgotten, and places that kind of decolonial emphasis on history, which is like the way in which the work is sort of positioned. And then I have this project in here, like my project, another one that I came back to later around that same time that I was working on getting really into risograph printing, so 5-color risograph for this one. I'm just thinking through like how can this book be an archival research document prior to a larger book? So this is actually related to something I'm still working on. This was initially released second edition 2022. A larger version of it will come out this year, and then there's like a much larger scale artist book that I'm developing. And the work really looks at Southern California, which a lot of the projects that I work on are either from California or their East Coast. I am from California originally, so my interest still lies there. And this project is like a 5-year project for me. So it emphasizes the relationship of land and thinking again about kind of like site and geography and place and the role of place in shaping communities and belonging, which is really like at the core of what the press does. So in this project, I was interested in translating both filmic language from Super 8 that I had filmed, HD video, which is on the left, and things that would be actual archival images, and to conflate them so that a viewer wouldn't necessarily know like which image came from which time period, because there's also research based in the project. The project really looks at the way that geography and place shape identity, from the perspective of being mixed race and Chicana and transracially adopted. And so there's a lot of emphasis on culture, like erasure, the history specific to what shaped Orange County's politics, which is a very complicated region in the US, and specifically in Southern California. So there's like a lot of research that is used to kind of talk about these images that comes up at the back of the book. And then also kind of shifting to California. So 2022, sometime around the same, all these projects kind of bleed into each other, but around that same time, I was working with the artist William Camargo, who's also based in Orange County and is someone, he grew up in the same county that I did. We just didn't know each other then. And his work is focused on Anaheim, California, which is a place that most people know because of the influence of Disneyland. And so William, who is a photographer and is really grounded in his photography practice, like we got to talking about designing this project together, which ultimately I designed the book, and my role often as publisher is designing the work, figuring out how the work of an artist fits into a publication. And in that sense, it's like collaborating with someone. And this was the first person, aside from Steph, where I was really directly asking, like, William, like, what do you want to see? How should we position the community archive? So something like this image toward the bottom, which is an archive from the Anaheim Public Library and printed on something that is a custom like screen print paper that I made. It became a conversation with him of like, how can we make the project talk about what it is that you're interested in that's different from how you take photographs and put them on a wall. And so this, I would say, like from a design perspective, gave me a lot of opportunities to start exploring like layout and thinking through concepts kind of related back to the first couple publications of how I might, translate someone's story. So we worked to create this project, talking about Anaheim of Orange County, California, and thinking about who has been there. So his emphasis is often on his community, friends, family members, people that he knows. He is most known for this image on the top right. This area will gentrify soon. His work is often commenting on the displacement of the brown working class, specifically within Mexican American and Mexican communities. And he is also known for making these intervention type posters where it's like him holding signage and kind of challenging status quo or dominant ways of thinking. So we tried to weave all that into the project to have moments of the protest signage, moments that were more like photographic portraits, like the photo on the top left of his father. That's his father getting a haircut by his brother. Friends who are down in the bottom right, and other friend who is the sort of self-portrait, or not self-portrait, but portrait towards the top, mixed with poetry that was written by also peers in the community, and an essay from someone who had been working on his an exhibition of his. So it was like taking a lot of information, trying to pull that into design and thinking through like special edition components. So we released this project as both book and also special edition. And that created like new challenges for the press. I feel like the press really grew around this time. And working on special editions is so different than just working on publication, which I didn't not know at the time. And then that kind of led into more recent projects that are where the press is today. So thinking about hardcover, larger edition sizes, like higher end finishing. I'm still risograph printing a lot, not exclusively. But there's a jump, like I want to go back just a few. There's a shift in quality that happens between Williams' project and Magli Duzant's project, Livia's Like That, which was published this past year. And so this is a like a 6-color risograph book that is hardcover. It's many pages, it's like 200 pages, and it is a much more ambitious project for what the press does. So I think that like when I look at the overall interest, I'm still working with storytelling. Pretty much everybody's projects has some element of that. This one in particular is pulled from the artist, like inspired by the artist's father as he gets dementia and is beginning to lose his memory, and the artist herself has moved to another country. There's a confluence of language learning and language loss that's going on. And so she writes this book that is based on an alphabet primer, which looks like this. And the structure of the book is all alphabet primers. So it is A through Z, and every single one is like, N for Naiku, it is an Ise shrine. And so there's like each one tells you a thing. Like it might be A is for aphasia, is the first one, and aphasia is memory loss, like dementia. And this one is really focused on creative nonfiction. So it's a different kind of book for me, that it is so much about it being like literature. It is meant to be read as literature, and each spread corresponds either with an image or it has a full spread kind of breaking, like they're passages and they break between form. So sometimes, like I can say on this one, bottom left, there's no alphabet primer here because it precedes on several pages before. Some of the primers last 3 pages, and other primers, as you can see, are just a few sentences. And so there's this relationship of pacing that happens in her book where you kind of having to meander the primers. You could read them in one sitting and put them down, and some of them are like longer stories. And so it asks something different of the reader. This one, in terms of form, is by far the most challenging book that I've worked on, just the scale alone and the kind of finishing quality. But I think the evolution of text and image in this one is like, it's also changing, it's challenging, like what I do as a publisher. And it was collaboratively designed with the artist. So she had a direct hand in like choosing the way that the sequence would form. And then the other book that was also recently published, same time frame, with Diana Guerra, is Fleeting Under Light. And this is also risograph, but it's a little bit mixed. Something I should have mentioned in this last one is that in Magli Duzant's, there's an element of hardcover and foil stamping and digital that takes place in the cover. Versus as I got into Diana's, we decided to do a fully digital cover because risograph, one, at that scale, I couldn't get it large enough. And two, it's just so hard to physically handle because it gives off ink. It's a printing process that never fully dries. So, like from a making perspective, there's just some limitations that come with this particular approach. So we made a decision to go with a digital offset cover. And then we also went with foil, which was the same kind of approach as Magli's. And the translation on Diana's work is all from anthotypes. So she's making these ephemeral images that cannot be fixed, like they're light sensitive. They're made from things like cabbage and beet and corn. And the images are sensitive and they have to be exposed in light, sometimes for months at a time, other times for many hours. And once they're made, if you expose them to light again, they start to disappear. So this kind of concept of like fleeting under light is both connected to the image making, but it is also connected to the focus of her work, which is about the experience of being an immigrant within New York City and assimilating into one culture, losing aspects of yourself and still holding on to your past. And this relationship of being kind of disoriented in a diasporic experience that is so relevant and relatable to most people who have migrated. And so her conversations that she has in the book are designed around text. This book is also bilingual. And there are moments where she's talking to her mother and she's speaking in Spanish and then she's speaking in English. And then the MTA officer language is like telling her to get off the platform in the subway. And it's all diffused and kind of like creating this experience of obfuscated memory or something that's disappearing. And so in Diana's work, we really looked at how could we use things like overlays. There's some short sheets, which is what these sheets are. They're like physically short in the book. And then there's, oh, I didn't put it in. There's some sheets that have like a semi-transparent vellum that overlaps on text. So it creates this diffused looking text component. And I think something we really thought about a lot with her project was just how to edit and design something that could again create that kind of embodiment. So it does go back to like the second project I showed you, the Sunstruck Ocean image one, and thinking about like how can we create disorientation on the page through the language, but so that a reader might start to feel or like see what the work is really about, not just to read it, like in text where it tells you that some of this is happening. So that one, those two are the most recent. A work that is currently in progress is this book called Anaheim Boulevard, Hood to Suburb by Alcaide Ramirez. And this project it's basically releasing right now, but it is a special edition. So small run, 30 copies, and it is in an accordion that is mostly digital offset. So kind of going back to digital printing, some risograph, but predominantly digital. And it is a focus on the artist's family history in Anaheim, Orange County. Alcaide is the studio mate of William Camargo's. There's a relationship there. And the work is a panoramic view of his neighborhood, specifically the boulevard he grew up on, thinking about the way that gentrification has displaced communities and wanting to kind of look at the history for him as an autoethnography. So he makes this structure where his story is told in these post-its that overlap the image. The image, when expanded, if anyone has seen like the Ed Ruscha, the Sunset Strip book that is quite famous. So you're looking at the Sunset Strip and you're seeing it from two sides. And this was definitely an influence to the artist, but instead of it just kind of being the images, he writes in his own history. So it'll be like he's at the donut shop and someone is giving him change. He's a little kid and he's kind of reflecting on like how this one shop's maybe been there for 20 plus years, or how there's this empty lot, or it's hard to see in this particular image, but these are some like very high rise higher end condominiums that are coming that are changing the kind of architectural landscape. And so our focus was on how to create this visual timeline of him being the photographer, looking at his neighborhood, him writing the notation about, how is it changing, like what's happening. And so the post-its become something that can go on top of the image. So the project is in progress. This is like our book dummy, but a choice that we made recently was to change the type design. So these are currently set in like Bembo, and we had him handwrite the post-its. So the final version will be his handwriting that goes over the photographs and is like his actual notation at post-it size scale that will feel a little bit more personal than just reading type that, could be set in like Times New Roman. Like I love Bembo as a typeface, but it doesn't look that different, right, from some classic serif typefaces. So there's something about that, like bringing in the hand component that should transform the book a bit. And then in the special edition, all these images come out of the book. So it's like the special edition folds down into this small kind of compressed 6x8 form. And then when it expands, it's an accordion that's 7 feet, and then the images tip in, they're just tucked into the front of the book. And then there's also an essay component as well in this one. So it's something that is different structurally for me. Accordion books are quite challenging to make, like physically, they ask a lot of you as a maker. It's also challenging as a printer, like to figure out how to print. You have to really think through the pagination of something like this and hinging and like the structure of the book. But it's a pretty special object in that sense. And then I put some photos in to give you a context of like, where do books live? Like, where are they beyond the context of the publishing like website, or let's say um, I don't know, wherever you're encountering them. I wanted to give you like some context for in book fairs, this tends to be the visual setup is having a table, having books on the table. And something that I think becomes clear in design, like if I think about a clear visual aesthetic of like what is it that I'm doing as the publisher, is trying to develop visual language for how all this work fits together. So I think in this particular image, like there's a kind of I feel like there are things that I do that are disparate and not always visually connected, but there's a kind of look to the publications that I work on. They often have, not always, but often have kind of like a muted or reduced color palette for the cover. Like the cover design on some of these is like in gray or it's in black and silver, or in this case, it's in that like single color citron. Or in Charles, like it's the full photographic image, or same with this book that I made of my own, but always this kind of like relationship to type and image that is either like image centric or type centric or, you know, really minimal that I think I've been working on. As I've been doing a lot of this work, we've also been doing a lot of programming. So these are photos from ICP's Photo Book Fest. This is Diana's work over in the corner. This is the artist. And this was the book that I had mentioned, her publication, Fleeting Under Light. And so it's kind of fun to like see some images of like what happens like at these fairs. It's like there's a lot of public programming and there's a lot of conversation around the choices made both in publication design, but also just in terms of like content and how we're communicating about the projects. This work was also a feature of the Latinx Project, their print media fair this past year, which was a really great space to focus on a lot of the books that I published. That was exciting. And then I had just like two last things. I think I'm like almost on time, Dimitri. I was like trying to keep track of the clock. Um, I have just like one last thing that I think is really inspirational. I think you all maybe read. Did you read Ulysses Carry On?
We started with it. Yeah, we started with Elise's book and that we started with that essay for sure.
Awesome. So I feel like this is something I come back to constantly. Is like a book is a space-time sequence. It's one of the many lines within his manifesto, The New Art of Making Books. And to me, this is like why I publish. Like this relationship of space time that can be compressed within a book is so unique and specific to the book form. I do think it's also something that exists in moving image, which is another medium that I work in. But I'm really interested in that relationship of like space time as a sequence that when we design a publication, we are having to contend with, whether it is chronological, linear, or nonlinear, whether it is bound or unbound, that there's just so much you can do with publication design to create something that is like a living archive or a living document. And so all the work that I'm making, like I think of them as living archives. They change based on whichever reader they go to, right? So each person is coming with a different set of experiences and observations and is going to notice something different about the book. And that's kind of the amazing part of any form of art. I think that really where like art and design, maybe in some moments like depart from one another, is that when design becomes not just function but is conceptually challenging, it starts to become, it like slips more into the like the tradition of visual art. And I feel like as an artist who also works as a designer and also as an educator who teaches both art and design, I'm constantly trying to blur that boundary of not having it feel like it is only designed for utilitarian purposes or it is only art for the sake of making art, right? Like I'm more interested in this richness of where the two come together and we can use design to make conceptually challenging and political objects. So I think I wanted to leave you with that.
That was awesome, Lindsay. Thank you so very much.
Of course.
You can't hear us clapping, but we're clapping.
Appreciated.
Great.
I
Oh,
should
yeah.
I unshare and we can chat
Yeah.
a little bit?
Yeah, if that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
If you're okay in a little bit on time.
absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. And so any questions for Lindsay?
I have a question. First of all, thank you for today's talk and for allowing the publication class to get a glimpse into what Seaton Street Press does. Um, you talked a lot about a lot of the work that you do is about decolonizing design. And that's something I try to explore with my practice too, and in the works that I design. So my question to you is, what has been the most challenging aspect of pursuing decolonizing design?
Yeah, if you had asked me that like a couple weeks ago, I would say it felt more possible. Not that it's easy, but I think that like politically, we're in a moment where I even thought about it as I was preparing my slides. I was like, oh, it's so hard because so many of these projects were made at a different moment in time where language around even DEI, right, was meant something different, was not as politicized. And so I think in this present moment, like literally as of this week, as of last week, decolonization may become a term that is targeted in the same way that other language has been targeted. And I think we may actually see real material consequences of trying to decolonize work as designers and artists, but also in terms of what we teach, that I think is just going to present a new host of challenges. Something that I have been in conversation with colleagues about is like this idea of belonging. And something that the press, the statement on the press, like has been about belonging for a while. But I'm seeing institutions kind of shift to this as saying, like, well, if people are targeting language around decolonial approaches, like, what does it mean about to say, like, we're making work about belonging? And so I think trying to find spaces like in design, there's so many great efforts and also just like really great educators who are doing this work. I think trying to find them, and like attaching to that a bit and being like, okay, there are spaces to do this. And like, I'm sure you all have encountered Vocal Type Studio, Trey Seals,
Trace,
which is like,
yeah, Trey actually spoke at
yeah.
the MFA a while ago. Yeah.
Wait, that's amazing. So like that's some of the best work of like thinking through a kind of decolonial practical usage, right, and type design connected to these political histories. That's so incredible. Like, I feel like we're very lucky to have people like that making that kind of work. So it maybe is a question of it's always hard to do something, particularly when it's being targeted. But I think that like it really is changing daily right now. And it's really hard to say like what's coming or how it might feel next week. But I would say like considering how language can be perhaps used in resistance to maintaining what you want to do. Like, what are ways that other language can be used in decolonial efforts that perhaps we don't know yet?
Thank you so much. Thank you for creating this space for artists to decolonize design, especially in today's extremely volatile political climate, where we're all kind of questioning what we create. So I think it's really important to continue using language as a tool and it provides us with a lot of power, and we need to kind of wield that power in a way that honors the people around us.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I wanted to ask if you've ever hesitated to make a piece of work because of that the topic may be controversial, or like you were afraid of getting pushback from a community because of the work you make. Because so in my head, what I'm kind of referencing is the tourism industry in the Caribbean, and it's kind of problematic, but it brings in a lot of money, and oftentimes locals are really proud of their culture and the people that come in. So I feel like me talking about tourism, uh, and how it's problematic is kind of like confrontational. So like that's why I'm asking this question. Like, if you have you ever made a work that you were scared to make because it was confrontational, and like how, if you did, how did you get over it?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Do you know about Forgotten Lands? Let me put them in the chat. Let me see if I can get out of my full screen mode from my InDesign file. A really good example would be this publisher who specifically has like the thing that came to mind, and you'll see it the second you click on this, is they have this shirt and they have ephemera that says decolonize the Caribbean. And their publisher who's making work, like they're making work like that, right? And I think that anytime we choose to make work about something that may not be well tolerated from like the general, if I just am like speaking broadly, it would be to say perhaps the view you hold is controversial, not that it should be, but that perhaps it is. And so the sensitivity to like how do you navigate that relationship, I think as an artist, as a designer, is really hard. But ultimately you have to make the work that you believe in, and that you look to people. I look to people who are doing something similar, right? So like how do you find someone who might also be feeling marginalized but empowered to speak about their community, and looking for peers who also do that, and looking for other models of people who are doing that, because if anything, it gives you the space to believe that it's possible, but it also validates that what you're doing is legitimate. And it can be really scary to work on something like that if you have no examples of it being done. Like, I think a lot of times if you're like, I'm going to make this project about such and such experience, I have no example of anyone doing it, could be scary. So I think trying to like find communities to see that reflected back. I will say, like, I have a project that is like currently being worked on with an artist that is really about Palestine, and it's controversial. And, from anywhere else in the world, many places in the world don't feel this should be a controversial topic, but in the US it is. And me and the artist have, gone back and forth for the past year trying to figure out the ethics of what kind of language can be included and which kind of language is literally going to be targeted and censored. And because I'm an educator and work for a liberal arts college, my funding is also tied to institutions that may or may not want to support a project like that. So, yes, like I am finding that it is very hard to navigate. And I don't have a clear answer for you, but I would just say, like, trying to make whatever it is you're doing possible, even if it is hard. And even if it feels like you might receive some negative feedback, it might still be important to do.
I mean, yeah, your feedback was really helpful, and you even like had an example, so I'm really grateful. So yeah, thank you for sharing your work, and the answers you gave have given me a lot to think about, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You guys want to do one more? A couple more?
I wanted to ask, so obviously you've produced and worked on a lot of really impactful work that brings, light to a lot of really important issues that don't always get talked about. But I was wondering, which one has been most impactful for you in your own practice? I know a lot of times I'm led to be reflecting on my own practice and my own work when I find a particularly interesting project. So I was wondering if you've had that, like, oh, maybe this is pushing me somewhere I hadn't expected with my own practice going forward for the future.
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like they all kind of do, and that it is always a reflection of where you are in the moment. So like I find for myself, when I worked on Stuff's book, the very first book that I published that was not my own, where it was like me working with someone, that book at that time was incredibly impactful. I would probably say it's still the most impactful, not even because the other books aren't, they're all so important to me and like equally important, but Stuff's book opened a pathway into publishing and into seeing the need for producing work like that. But it's not to say like, because then I deal with immigration issues like many more times. So it's not even like, like it keeps happening. It's like a constant theme for me that I'm invested in trying to publish the work of. And so I would say like it set me on that course. But then each book teaches me something new, and each book reaches people in ways I can't expect. So I get feedback as the publisher often about how meaningful someone's work is, that, every once in a while I get a glimpse into that. And it's just deeply gratifying to be like, oh, like I'm making someone's work possible in the world, like physically, materially. And that feels rewarding. So it's like, it's really hard to say like which, because I think as artists, we're constantly changing too. And like my goals are constantly changing kind of based on what I'm producing. But I think usually when people ask me a question like that, it's like I go back to the beginning to be like, this one book kind of changed the trajectory or like course of my publishing practice.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind of response to that. So
Thank you.
I have a quick question. I noticed, like, well, in your talk, you were expressing how you came to like the different papers you use, the different mediums you use, like how you like publishing and binding. But then when I was going through your website, I saw it in your stratagems and you mentioned it. You worked with Super 8 and then kind of juxtapose that with the why Super 8? Like what made you decide to, did you have access to it or just like hunt it down? Like how did you land on that?
Yeah, I film with it. So I work in instant analog. Like I shot FP100C pack film, which is Fujifilm that's no longer in production. I still shoot on it because I bought like a surplus when it went out of production. And so I have a tendency to work in instant analog, and Super 8 is the instant analog of film.
Yeah.
So, it was made for the purpose, for anyone who doesn't know what Super 8 is, like it was made for the purpose of families. Kodak produced this type of film where like you could basically just pop it in the film, like into the camera and film. It's really simple. It's like anyone can use it. And as a person who's not trained in traditional darkroom, it was to me, it's like how I don't know 16. I'm about to learn 16 because I'm like pretty attracted to film quality and filmic language, but it's much harder to use a Bolex, which has three lenses, and to put film into something like that, it's much more challenging. Right. So like it's kind of relationship of like I'm interested in the filmic language, but I want something that's accessible. I'm also interested in the compression of time. So
Hmm.
in that particular project, I'm working from black and white, like gelatin silver prints that are in the archives at the place that I do my archival research at UCI in Southern California. And it's something where, like, in the archives, I encounter darkroom prints. And when you put that all together in a book, like I only showed you a few images from the book, but there's several images in there that are archival that I didn't film or I didn't photograph, but they're mixed in with my film stills and my photographs. And intentionally, there's never a moment in the book that tells you which figure or which plate is which. So this kind of relationship of like challenging time and challenging archives and the way that archival information can be presented is so like integrated in how I work as an artist. So I don't have like a good conceptual reason as to like why Super 8s per se. Like I personally am very drawn to the kind of language. It's obfuscated, it's like lost information. It's so imperfect, but it's also quick. And
Hmm.
so like it lends itself to like a documentary hand.
I just when I came across like like there's just something so refreshing about it too. And then seeing the video where you see them like you switch from the HD to it was just like just I don't know. It really inspired me because I've been working on something kind of similar, and so I thought that that was just wonderful to see. So
I'm
awesome.
so happy to hear that. Thank you for sharing.
Let's have one time for one more. Is it okay?
Yeah, I have time. I was like worried you all didn't have time.
I think people are pretty invested and involved, so we can.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, thank you so much for everything that you showed. I'm just really taken aback that I've been an art director working in the advertising industry for over 20 years. And sorry, it's sad to say, and everyone's going to hate me for this. I've never heard of independent publishing during my time. Like that was never discussed. And I think maybe it was taboo because it was too artsy. It wasn't commercial enough. Which brings me a little bit to where I'm working on in terms of ethics in advertising and in particular ethics in AI. Uh, I guess my question to you is, do you ever see the kind of conversation we had today about process and about film and about paper and about printing? Do you ever see in the future that type of discussion when it comes to AI?
I think we're headed there. because I think it's inevitable that designers and artists and any kind of media makers will use AI. I don't personally really use it beyond like basic software editing for, let's say, like some generative functions in Photoshop or some things like Grammarly, which has a function, for proofreading. But like generally, I've tried to stay away from it for ethical concerns. But I think also because it just feels like it alters something I'm not ready to give up yet. But I don't think it's wrong for artists to use it as a tool. Like everything we use, right? It's a medium. It's going to become integrated in most of our media. And so I think like these conversations around process, materiality, we're going to need to have them because we're going to get to a place, I think, where naturally it's just going to be integrated in some people's work. So how do we then talk about it beyond just the scope of saying like, well, they made that with AI, which currently most educators are scared, and freaked out about. And I think even and I don't know how much this has come up in your class, but like I do think this is a concern also for people in media arts where we might be in communication design or some kind of digital media. I teach in digital media at Skidmore, where like this becomes a question of does it put us out of work? Right. In the same way that the fear of Photoshop coming put like sign painters and analog graphic artists out of work. Right. Either you learned the software and you became a digital graphic designer or you didn't have a job. And so I think that like there's a lot of ethical and like political questions around what AI will do to us and what will happen. But I think a lot about Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message, which is a theoretical text in new media that it really tells us that like the medium shifts us culturally. And so ultimately, like it's going to shift us culturally. I'm super curious to see like what conversations will we be having and how will we determine it as another medium that we can think through, hopefully with some resistance to the way it might manipulate and kind of force us to lose some authenticity. My hope is that we retain that even as technology is advancing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. I thought this was great in terms of learning, again, something that I had never heard of. And I'm so excited for this class and really everything going forward. So I appreciate it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
All hi. What are you working on now, or what's next for the press? What are you really excited about?
So I'm working on an exhibition in Rome that's opening this summer that is like Risograph publishers. So kind of similar to the Penumbra show that happened this past fall in New York. There'll be one that's taking place in Rome at a bookshop in Italy. And I'll go for that one. So like myself and Matt Neff, who is the artist that I showed for Hyperopia, that like really colorful risograph book, we're working on a poster design for it. And a bunch of like most of the books that I have made are going for it, which is just exciting. Like it's always nice to have something international in terms of like getting to travel and, see the books in a different context. So I'll go for that. I'm working on my 5-year book that will become like a 200-page large project this coming year. That will coincide with my residency at Lightwork, which is a photography residency where I'll work on the book dummy and like work on sequencing and probably spend a lot of time just like picking an image sequence. So I'm trying to take a little bit of a break from publishing other people's work this year, although I still have like loose ends. Tyler Rico and I are working on a book. Who some of you may know Tyler because Tyler teaches with you, Dimitri. And Tyler and I will release that project in March of this year that will likely coincide with multiple formats, which is a book fair in Boston. And then I have one more release for this year. I can't remember what the other thing is I'm supposed to do. Mostly backfilled orders and like finishing production on some of these books that I showed you that were released last year that are not done being bound. And trying really hard to take a break is the other like deeply important part of all of that.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, folks. What else? Anything else? Shall we let Lindsay have dinner? Going once, twice. Okay. Oh. All right, I'm going to pause recording.